Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himbar, and today I'm going to be talking about another fantasy essay. It's been a little over a month since I talked about one. I've talked about 9 already, so if you want to go look at that playlist um, by different authors like Michael Moorcock, Tolkien, Ursula K. Le Guin, one by Gene Wolfe. There's a couple others in there as well. And this is actually going to be my second essay I'm going to be briefly discussing. By Fritz Leiber, actually. So this is the book I used for the last one. But this one is the Anima Archetype in Science Fantasy, again by Fritz Leiber. So I will probably get to more of these essays at some point, but a lot of them are specific. So like this one's about Robert E. Howard, for example, and there's one about James Branch Cabell, which I haven't read yet, so I'll probably read that one afterwards. There's one about archaisms in fantasy, which I will probably read actually. Probably sooner rather than later. But this one I wanted to read because it focuses, well, it calls it science fantasy, which I think is Leiber's term he's using here for just SFF, what we normally call it, science fiction fantasy today, which is basically just also a term for speculative fiction, though SFF leaves out horror for whatever reason. So it's not very long. It's from pages 76 to 82. So it's pretty short, all things considered. It is about a Jungian archetype, the Anima, of course. Carl Jung is a psychiatrist, psychologist. He's Swiss, I believe. And I think he was a student of Freud. So I'm not actually all that familiar. It's been a long time since I took a psychology class. It's kind of embarrassing how long it's been. I'm getting older somehow. Anyways, this essay originally appeared in Lighthouse number 15 in 1967. I don't know what Lighthouse is, to be honest. I looked up like magazine called Lighthouse. I found a bunch of different stuff that probably is not it. So I don't actually know what Lighthouse is. So he just goes over. He basically is going to kind of define what anima is, and then basically just give examples in sci-fi and fantasy. So. Says the late Carl Jung was the only big thinker of modern times to take fantasy and science fiction seriously, both as literature and as a source of insights into the human psyche. Jung was notably less inclined than other big thinkers to shut out of his serious ponderings various realms of discourse and areas of creation on the grounds that they were crackpot or mere entertainment for the mob, which is pretty cool. I like that if that's true. I mean, I assume Leiber's not lying to me right here, but again, I've not studied Jung really much at all. So, but I know Leiber had. So, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. So it says also Jung's chief self-confessed debt to science fantasy concerns the archetype he calls the anima. So then he says, let us attempt to define archetype and anima. He basically, let's see. It's also interesting that Jung, he says Jung considered psychology a primitive science, which I assume has something to do with the fact that that you can't measure a lot of this psychology stuff, that it's not, basically we understand very little, right? And then let's see. So he also makes a point that Jung often changed his definitions on things. He would never give it the same way to you twice, basically. So archetypes are figures inhabiting the unconscious minds of all men and women. That's the definition of archetype, though. He says they get there by social transmission of something a bit deeper. They include the anima, the animus, child, father, mother, maiden, shadow, and wise old men. He says they are chief actors in most myths and some stories, which, I think is important that he's connected here to Jung, that by not ignoring fictional stories, Jung was being kind of smart in some sense, right? Because if these are the chief actors in our stories, then you would think they're kind of important. So, especially since when you even go back to something like myth, which just means story anyways, right? We could talk about it another time, but myth is important still. And myth is not exactly the same as fantasy. I'm not saying that either, but it does have an important connection, I think. And so let's see. So then he just gets directly to what the anima is. He says the anima is man's female component, forever dwelling in him, yet never at one with him. Perhaps only because Jung himself was a man, the anima always seems more interesting and powerful than the mirroring component in a woman, the animus. In ways, the anima is the mother of Freud's Oedipus complex, as she exists in the sun. She is the eternal feminine, a cruel and jealous goddess, also very wise in the realm of poetry and mathematics. She is the woman you can never escape, who tempts you to seek her in material women and upbraids and punishes you if you forsake that quest. She's also the dark side of the self, the soul that can never be pinned down. It made me think of Leiber's novel, which came out sometime later, called Our Lady of Darkness, which you should read if you haven't. It's a great horror novel. And then he kind of explains, so she comes in 3 forms, is what he says, which is pretty interesting because I've seen a list that has 4 forms, but he gives I don't know, maybe I should read it. Let's see. To the young boy, a clearly discernible anima form appears in his mother, and this lends her the radiance of power and superiority, or else a demonic aura of even greater fascination. But because of the anima's ambivalence, the projection can be entirely negative. Much of the fear which the female sex arouses in men is due to the projection of the anima image. An infantile man generally has a maternal anima, an adult man in the figure of a younger woman. The senile man finds compensation in a very young girl or even a child. I can see this also in some later Fafhrd and Grey Master stuff. So he basically then just goes on to give some examples, and he says the big ones would be something like She by H.R. Haggard. Essentially, it's sequels as well. And he also points out this Benoit's L'Atlantide, translated in English as Atlantide. I'm not sure. I've never read it. It says Benoit was accused of plagiarizing Haggard, but Leiber is essentially saying he wasn't plagiarizing. He was, using this anima concept, this archetype. So he wasn't plagiarizing at all something because Haggard was using this archetype as well, which is not exactly. I haven't talked about archetypes before. I have made videos before actually and talked about before how it's rather hard to rip off something. I feel like to plagiarize something. A lot of times when you're getting something that is like inspired by, it's really just using the same sources. When you have something like the Broken Sword by Paul Anderson and The Lord of the Rings, for example, have very similar sources. And even like a work of Melniboné and Children of Hurin, for example, have similar sources. They don't rip off each other. But then you also have this difference between inspiration, which maybe is directly inspired, but in this case, it's good to add maybe that they are taking these archetypes, these collective memory like type of things that we get imbued into us, essentially assuming that, and he's assuming, I don't think Jung questions ever that like when you're raised, you're going to be raised either as a man or a woman, essentially. And so essentially, I believe what it is that the anima is something for men to conquer, to basically become more feminine, the good parts of femininity, right? The things we call femininity. And then the animus is the opposite, essentially, for the women to take these things that they learn, right, to be women, and then to become a little bit more manly in some ways because there's some good traits that men have, right? There's masculine traits as well. I could be butchering that. So I don't think I am, though. And so he gives a lot of examples. For example, he says John Erskine's Private Life of Helen of Troy. And then he says the anima can also appear as an angel of light. A psychopomp points the way to the highest meaning. He gives a lot, though. He says generally, though, she is more or less immortal. And then, let's see. He gives a lot of examples here that I'm not really familiar with. To Walk the Night, published in 1937, the year of Lovecraft's deaths. Death marks a turning point in American science fantasy. So he talks about that, which is interesting to me. I haven't read that, so maybe I'll go read that. And then he also says, according to most modern psychologists, a serious writer has no more insight into mental and emotional troubles than any other layman. Of course, as far as his own are concerned, the same is true of a psychiatrist. So he's essentially, again, ripping out the psychiatrists who don't take this stuff seriously, essentially. Or not, you don't have to take it necessarily seriously, but to look at it, something worth studying, essentially. It says, clearly chief among the fictional figures is the white goddess of Robert Graves, the triple goddess of his 7 Days in New Crete, which apparently is titled Watch the North Wind Rise in North America. That's what he says. Let's see. Let's see. She remains the inspirer of true poets even in our current dark age when she is shadowed over by science and male deities. She is cruel, beautiful, and forever ready to shatter the lives of men for their own enrichment. Which I think is shattering the lives of men is a good. I think Jung would probably say something along the lines of an inflated ego being popped, basically, having to rethink stuff. And so he says there's three personae that Jung described: Nimue, the maiden, and then the nymph or the holy child. And so he says, it occurs to me that the three sisters of De Quincey's Suspiria de Profundis are anima figures. No question, at any rate, about the third sister, she who moves in a tigerish way, storming all doors, Mater Tenebrarum, Our Lady of Darkness. You can definitely see that. See, like, and I guessed that, though, on page 2, that on page 4, he was going to talk about this. And you can see the inspiration. This was before he wrote that novel. Again, go read Leiber's Our Lady of Darkness. He messes with Jungian psychology a lot here, and I didn't know enough to point out the anima archetype he's messing with, but he definitely messes with it in other ways. So obviously Leiber was a fan. And then let's see. It says second only to the triple goddess as an anima figure is Barbara Haggers, the supreme mathematician, profound physicist, and insanely jealous lover, and Ward Moore's Bring the Jubilee. I've not read that either. In fact, most of the stuff he mentions here, I haven't read. And then there's some other ones. So, like, for example, Clifford D. Simax. I've read a little bit about this guy, actually. But Waystation, Edison's Wormwood Boris, the Princess Sophonisba, which I have not yet read, actually. Cabell's Cream of the Jest is La Belle Attar. In Jurgen, however he says it, is Dorothy La Désirée, and the Earth Mother, Soretta. In Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep is Asenath Waite. Wow, I don't know how to say these names, apparently. And then in Bloke's Psycho. And then he says, this isn't fantasy, but psychopathology. And he's saying you should read the book rather than watch it. And then Hans Heinz Ewers Alraune, I don't really know. Alraune, which I think is also the name of this anima archetype in the book or whatever. So, and then he says, he even talks about Edgar Rice Burroughs here, and he says, I don't propose to argue whether or not Deja Thoris and Thuvia are animi. Come to think of it, though, Phaedor must be one, that desirable evil daughter of the Mai Tai Sheng, father of the Holy Therns. And so, I mean, it would definitely help. In fact, this is what I had to do, is I had to go look at the anima archetype again a few times just to see a bigger idea of what he's using here. And I think like a good example actually that came to my mind is I've often heard a lot of people are very uncomfortable with the description of Shelob, for example, in The Lord of the Rings. And I think she could be an anima representation, but I think it's very much contrasted with another anima representation of Galadriel, and specifically with the file of Galadriel. That is. So that's my thought, at least. That's one that Leiber does not mention here. So then he says, he mentions a bunch more, right? Like Siren, the mermaid, the wood nymph, Grace, Erokeen's daughter, Lamia, Succubus. Right, and these all have different, they're not all good, right? So that's the interesting thing about this, right? Is that this anima comes in different forms, right? So but it is interesting, almost all of these, right? These are all written by men in most cases. And I don't know, it's interesting because I don't think Jung would actually say that men don't have like animus as well. But again, I think that goes back to how you were raised, essentially, and what roles you were getting put into when you are raised. And let's see. Moralizing critics will say that these figures are projections of soulful emotional states and are nothing but worthless fantasies. But were there not such beings long ago in an age when dawning human consciousness was still wholly bound to nature? What is more, these beings were as much dreaded as adored, so that their rather peculiar erotic charms were only one of their characteristics. Man's consciousness was then far simpler in its possession of an absurdly small, an unlimited amount of what we now feel to be an integral part of our psychic being disports itself merely for the primitive projections far and wide. I'm not sure. Like, what I want more on this one, actually, guys, is I want more feedback on this one, because this one is a very interesting one, and in some ways, this almost seems like something I'd hear in a like a cultural anthropology class as well. Though obviously this is more bent towards psychology, and it's just, I don't know. I'm not that well I couldn't gather my thoughts well on this one. I didn't want to go read a ton on Jung, but I wanted just to point out what this cool little essay. And so, I mean, he talks a little bit more. He ends with some quotes by Jung. Um, he mentions Buddha, right? A vision of Buddha and a beautiful young lady who suddenly becomes a skeleton. He mentions a Weird Tales cover, which is always cool. But overall, like, I enjoyed this one because it's made me think. And I'm okay with thinking. I don't necessarily want to come in here and give you all the answers if I can. Actually, guys, so this is really short. I could potentially find a way to get this to you somehow if you can't find it online. If you want to read it. But let me know what you think of it, because I feel like I've just shared some general thoughts about it real quick. I probably messed up somewhere and it could have been more clear. But I thought it was interesting to discuss an archetype in fantasy, and definitely one I definitely don't hear of. When I generally hear people say the archetype, I don't think that's what most people are thinking. I don't think anima or animus for that matter. So it was definitely a different one, and that sexual undertone or eroticism associated with it is something I feel like Leiber consciously explore, especially if you read like the last two Fafhrd and Grey Mouser novels. But even then, all of Leiber stuff is erotic in some way. It's not like, oh, what's the word? It's not really like reading eroticism. It's not really pornographic, so to speak. Maybe a little on the last Fafhrd and Grey Mouser book, sadly, but it's definitely something Leiber is always interested in. So it's not surprising that this is one of the essays he wrote. I have shared an essay by Leiber before, which is Monsters and Monster Lovers. Considerably longer, this one, definitely very different topic. That was another one I really enjoyed, though. So, but this has been Liam and Liam's Icing. Let me know what you think of this little essay. Let me know your thoughts. Maybe if you have more, because I like thinking. I'm okay with not having some answers, actually. I think, which is probably why I study what I do. I like having some answers in some things, but other times it's like, I want to think about this, and we'll see what it is. I mean, especially since like these archetypes and Jung stuff seems to be a priori rather than, well, not, I guess. So anyways, I'll catch you next time.